Hey guys, thanks for tuning in again. This is All Things Chess with Cybertal. I am Cybertal. First off, this is my lucky chess playing hat. If you don't like it, we can't be friends. And this is my new shirt. It's pink. It says Hardcore Wrestling. It has a rainbow. And it has a unicorn on it. And if you don't like that, we just can't be friends. But thanks for tuning in again. This is my fourth video in the Queen's Gambit series. I think I'm going to make this one the last because I do have some other ideas for helping train you guys and make you guys better at chess, but this has been fairly informative, well received so far, so I thank you for that. This fittingly is the end of the Queen's Gambit series. This is Beth Harmon's final showdown against her nemesis. I won't give away too many details for people who haven't seen the series so far, but her big bad nemesis is Vasily Borgov, the world chess champion in this series. She experiences some disappointment against him, which I thought was perfectly done. Beth's character was made so good so early that it was completely appropriate for her to finally run up against a wall, which is completely natural, because if you had a chess player with no formal training suddenly show up and beat even the world chess champion, that would be completely unrealistic. So I really enjoyed the way they did that and helped Beth Harmon's character struggle and grow in the face of adversity rather than just steamroll everything. But this was the final game in the series. She is white in this game. Vasily Borgov is black. This is based off more or less a real-life game, as we come to expect with Gary Kasparov at the helm. This is Vasily Ivanchuk against Patrick Wolff in the 1993 Biel Interzonal. Later in the game, it does stray away from the original game, but it follows it pretty faithfully up to a course. So we'll look at the game, and then I'll detail where it branches off. Just as a heads up, this will probably be the longest video in the series that I've done so far. I deeply encourage you to go look at the annotated PGN file that'll list in the comments to this video, because I will have to skip a bunch of stuff, because I don't want to make this video too long. But this is the longest game that we looked at so far. It's got a lot of detail to it. So please check the comments for this video. We'll have a more detailed annotated version for you guys to go over. But Beth is white. She plays d4, which is completely fitting because we get the Queen's Gambit. And just as fittingly, the Queen's Gambit is accepted. Early in their series, when she played the Queen's Gambit, it wasn't accepted, which I guess has some symbolism for the title of the series. But here it is accepted. For anyone looking for an opening repertoire, c6 is the Slav. That's perfectly fine. e6 is the classical way. It's perfectly fine. And then knight c6 is a Chigorin defense, probably the most interesting way to match the Queen's Gambit. Maybe not the soundest, but it leads to the most interesting play. But here, Borgov accepted the Queen's Gambit. e4, that's not standard, but it's the most aggressive way to fight against the Queen's Gambit. Standard main line is knight f3, and there are literal thousands of games from this position with a humongous amount of theory. e4 is more aggressive, and it leads to a bit more wide open of a tactical brawl than otherwise, which matches Beth Harmon's style in the series. And for anyone looking for a more imbalanced game, e4 is definitely the better choice. Borgov/Wolff plays knight c6. Perhaps not the best move, it's the most provocative move, because it sort of entices white's pawn forward in the same way that you might in, say, Alekhein's defense, where you sort of entice white's pawns to come forward with the hopes of either attacking or blockading them later. Bit more standard from this position. e5 is the most classical response. Knight f3. And there are hundreds of games from this position. Another choice would be knight f6 instead. And this is very similar to an Alpin or c3 Sicilian, where white has a strong point on e5, which gobbles up space on the king's side, and good attacking chances. And in exchange, black has a strong point on d5, and you could potentially blockade the light squares. So very imbalanced game. It's a good position for a struggle. But knight c6 is also very provocative. Bishop e3, probably not the most accurate. Knight f3 is probably more accurate, but like I said, I don't want to make this video too long, so I'll leave that for the comments for you guys. But bishop e3, knight f6, knight c3, and e5. Fairly standard idea in this structure. Black wants to claim center in the space before white gets in d5 unopposed. So e5. d5 is fairly standard. Taking an e5 wouldn't really give white anything, so d5 is the principled move, gaining space in the center. Knight e7, not the most accurate. I don't want to go too deep into the opening, but just an aside, knight e5 is much more accurate here. It forces white to create some concessions in trying to regain the c4 pawn. Knight e7 is just a bit too compliant, and it gives white a very easy game going forward. But bishop x4, knight g6, f3. First, let's look at this position. Just in general, white is definitely better here. White has an edge in central space. His pawns in e4 and d5 sort of dictates the flow of the game. White has an edge in central space, and that allows white to sort of dictate the pace and dictate where the play is going to be. Generally, in this sort of structure, white wants to push on the king side. He wants to get sort of some sort of king side pawn push going. And generally, black doesn't really have any play other than sort of responding to what white does. Here in a bit, we'll talk about the reason why that is. In the game, Ivanchuk / Harmon chooses f3. Probably not the best. In this sort of structure, h4 is very valuable to include. Black sort of has two main choices. He can choose to play h5 to stop the white pawn from advancing, but that creates a target on h5 for white. Or black can just allow it to the white pawn to advance, and that just gains a lot of space for white on the king side. Usually in this sort of structure, black just blockades it. Just an aside, allowing it to push forward in this position is just bad. Knight f4. And here, bishop f1 is very strong. The knight on f4 is in serious danger. And even if the black knight doesn't get trapped, white has a good initiative and good chances on the king side. So h5 is standard here, knight f3, and then g3. And this inclusion has just been, the inclusion of h4 and h5 has just been very strong for whites. Now if black castles king side, the pawn on h5 is just very weak. And if black doesn't castle king side, it's hard to really find a place of safety for the black king. So f3 isn't necessarily bad, but the inclusion of h4 and h5 would be a little bit stronger here, in my opinion. Also notice the pawn chain extending from g2 to d5. All of these pawns are in light squares. That makes white's dark squared bishop one of the most important pieces on the board. If white loses control of the position, or if that dark squared bishop is allowed to be traded off somehow, it creates a great risk for white of, say, a knight landing on d4, a knight landing on f4, or generally just a dark square blockade that white's unable to break. So committing that pawn to f3 so early does create a positional risk for whites. But bishop d6, queen d2, bishop d7, knight ge2. Again, here h4 is even stronger because it has a lot more aggressive intent. h5, castle long, and this is an option for white in this sort of structure. Castle, king b1, and here white's just going to play this like a same-ish king's Indian, for those familiar with that structure. Here, white can just push forward on the king side and go for a super aggressive attack. When you see opposite side castling like this, white's going to be playing on the king side against black's king. It'll be very important for black to develop his own play on the queen side. But it's really hard to find where that play is going to come from for black, at least right now. So this would be the sort of position where I'd be very comfortable with white. But knight g2, not bad, just not very aggressive. a6, b5, and then a4. This is one of the first clear mistakes from white. White hasn't played the position necessarily as aggressively as he could, but he hasn't made an outright error. But a4, in my opinion, is an outright positional error. And this sort of brings us to a more general discussion of goals in this sort of position. So let's say white plays, let's just throw in a couple normal moves. So castle, castle. When you're evaluating a position and evaluating how to get play out of a position, one of the most important things to look at is where your pawn breaks are. And for those of you who don't know, a pawn break is where you bring your pawn in contact with another pawn to threaten to trade those pawns off and to open up a line. So let me just give an example. Here for black, c6 would be a pawn break, because it brings two pawns into contact with each other. For white, a4 would be a pawn break, because it brings two pawns in contact with each other and threatens to open up a line. One of the strongest chess players in the 1700s was Andrei Danikon-Philidor. He wrote a couple of operas, but he was also an extraordinarily strong chess player, especially for his time. The most important thing he developed was the theory of pawn play. And one of the things that he said is that pawns are the soul of chess. And I 100% agree. How you play with your pawns is going to sort of dictate the rest of your position. It's sort of like the deeper structure of the position that your pieces play around. So here, when looking for his play, both sides need to figure out what pawn breaks they want to go for. Here, white doesn't really have any pawn breaks he'd like to play. f4 isn't a terribly strong move, and that's really the only pawn break that white is interested in. a4 sort of does, and just like in the actual game continuation, this sort of does black's job for him. It sort of opens up the side of the board that black wouldn't mind playing on. Really here, white would like to more either play on the king side or piece maneuver on the queen side to take advantage of some weak squares. Whereas in this position, black has one pawn break in particular that he's really interested in. That's eventually playing f5. Why that pawn break in particular? It hits at the base of white's central pawn structure. It hits at the e4 pawn, which is a very important pawn in white's central structure. It gains space on the king side, which is a side of the board that black could potentially attack on. And it threatens to push that pawn forward to f4. You see this sort of structure in the King's Indian as well. So in this particular position, black is most interested in long-term preparing f5, the pawn move, the pawn break. And white is most interested in either preventing f5 and continuing to maneuver, or potentially moving his kingside pawns forward to gain extra space. So with all that said, a4 isn't a great move because it's playing on the side of the board that white really doesn't want to play on. It doesn't necessarily gain white anything to trade to open up the a file or to trade a pawns or anything like that. Probably the best move for white here instead of a4 is knight c1, castle, and knight d3. And this is what I meant about the piece maneuvering. It's aiming his knight for that weak square on c5. When you're improving your knights as a minor piece, you want to find places on the board where they can't be attacked by pawns. Those are called outpost squares. So that hole on c5 is a very strong outpost for white's knights. One example line, a5, and then this is a completely different position because here a4 does make a lot of sense, because suddenly it highlights the weakness of that pawn move on a5. And just move forward a little bit to demonstrate why. White has a very nice position here. Both his knights are aiming for that weak square on c5. That pawn on a5 is very weak because it's isolated. It can't be guarded by another black pawn. This is a very nice position for black. This is a good solid edge for white. So, in the game, a4, I know I've sort of talked for a bit on this, but a4 is really the first clear positional error from white's, and sort of fritters away a lot of white's advantage. So castle, castle, queen e7. Just an aside, h5 is an interesting move here. Black has a lot of flexibility in this position. He can choose to play on both sides of the board if he'd like to. Because white can't respond with h4 in this position, because it would be hanging, black can actually move this pawn to h4, and maybe even as far as h3 in some positions. But just an aside, queen e7 is perfectly solid, but h5 would be very interesting. Rook a c1. This is another not great move. Typically, you only want to move your rooks when it's absolutely clear where those rooks belong. Here, white really isn't sure where he'd like to put his rooks, because there's no open files yet. Rooks are sort of drawn to open files like a magnet, because this position doesn't have any open files, it's not yet clear where white should put either of his rooks. So, in my opinion, this would be a position where another improving move would be more appropriate. Here, king h1 is just sort of an all-purpose general improving move. It steps the king off this g1 to a7 diagonal. So, one of black's general positional threats is to play bishop c5 and to trade off that important dark square bishop that we were talking about earlier. By playing king h1, that prevents black from getting that bishop off the board. Also, white can also think about g4 and rook g1, just sort of a general kingside advance, and that sort of tucks the white king away from that, any danger that might result from that. So, rook a c1, not necessarily bad, but we don't know yet if the rook belongs in c1, so it doesn't make sense for it to go there. Knight h5, sort of a general good all-purpose maneuvering move. h5 is also still appropriate here, king h1 and h4. And black has good play here. You can continue with knight h5. The pawn on h4 sort of discourages g3. And if black can prevent or discourage g3, that makes f4 a good potential outpost square for both of his knights. And that's discussed in the PGN notes of this game. But knight h5 is perfectly fine. g3, preventing knight f4, or does it? h6 prevents bishop g5, and someday potentially plans g5, which helps lock down on white's king side. Bishop c2, rook a b8. This is just sort of general maneuvering. It doesn't necessarily have a purpose. a b, rook a1. This is probably the first clear, 100% clear error of the game, because it allows black some dangerous tactical opportunities. Bishop d3 is just more accurate. Knight d1. And this is sort of a key position for the notes, and I don't want to go in too far detail, because like I said, I don't want to make the video too long, but in the notes I examined the most critical move for black. We talked earlier about pawn breaks. Your critical moves are almost always pawn breaks. Here, f5 is absolutely the principal and critical move. If black can get this in successfully, he's almost certain to be doing absolutely fine. In this particular position, it costs a piece, and I'll just show the important line quickly. Knight h4. And black is down a piece here, but he has a very, very dangerous initiative. White's kingside is completely open. Black can follow up with putting his other rook on the f-file. So I list the variation for this in the notes. I would encourage you to go there and look over that. Basically, black is perfectly fine. And if black is fine after achieving f5, he has to be doing very, very well. Rook a1, one of the reasons it's not the best move is it robs white's pieces of his their coordination. So after rook a1, black plays rook a8, b4 is the appropriate move here. Knight d1, bishop h3, sort of discombobulating white's pieces even more, and then f5. And this is coming with even more force now, because the rook on a1 and the rook on f2 are very poorly placed. You can just compare it to the earlier variation. Both those pieces are just flat out worse placed than they were here. So in the PGN file, I go through the variation here. It's even more favorable for black. It's a point where white's doing very well just to hang into the game. But rook a8, another just sort of general all-purpose maneuvering move, but black definitely had better at this point. Bishop d3, bishop b4. Not the best move. Black can just hold tight. The problem with bishop b4 is that it doesn't really threaten anything. White would be absolutely thrilled if black were to trade his bishop off for that knight. Then his bishop on e3 would be an unopposed monster. But white takes. Queen c2, not the best. Knight c1 is the correct move. Once again, the idea is knight b3 and heading for that weakness square on c5. So queen c2 just sort of continues the general all-purpose maneuvering. Bishop c5. This is a bit of an achievement that we talked about. That bishop on e3 is very important. And getting that bishop off the board leaves white's dark squares potentially weak, just because those pawns on d5, e4, and f3 can no longer influence the dark squares. My favorite world champion, Tigran Petrosian, said that pawns can't move backwards. which a lot of times from the older generation of players, the more simple a statement is, the more profound it is. The fact that pawns can't move backwards makes every pawn move you make incredibly important, because it's a commitment to a structure for the rest of the game that you can never take back. So white's happy with the central space that he has, but one downside is that his dark squares are always going to be a little bit tender here. So knight d1, he wants to at least get a little bit of improvement for the bishops coming off the board, so if black takes on e3, knight takes e3 at least improves that knight. So bishop d6, just holding tight. He could trade, but the problem with that is now that pawn in c7 is very weak, and that knight on a3 really is very well placed. So black does make the right choice of just holding tight. Now the knight on d1 sort of looks silly, and white has to invest a little bit more time to improve it. Knight f2, just sort of continuing the general improvement spree, prevents bishop h3, reconnects his rook along the first rank, maybe preparing rook c1 or something like that. But this does allow black a very interesting opportunity. Knight hf4. This is, and I'm glad they sort of played this up in the series, because this was sort of drummed up as a very serious and determinative moment for the game, which it is. This is a spectacular move. It's a piece sacrifice, but it's sort of a positional piece sacrifice. Black doesn't necessarily get immediate mate for the investment of the piece. He gets a couple of pawns, and he gets humongous piece pressure. You look at this position conceptually, other than the rook on a8, each of black's pieces is pointed towards the white king side. The bishop on d6, if you remove the pawn on d5, it would. The bishop on d7 is, the queen is in the general vicinity of the king side, and both the black knights are on the king side. Take my hat off. So this piece sacrifice is justified, because it sort of wakes black's pieces up and weakens white's king side drastically. So excellent move. It's not mandatory, but it is the most principled move. When all of your pieces are set up for an attack, that's when you really need to start thinking about moves like this to open up the position and create pressure. White declines. He's not required to take. Rook c1 sort of dodges the main silliness. I give the main variation, but I'll just quickly go through it. c1, next f3. At this point, I personally like e5 the most. When you're defending against an attack, it's almost always a very good idea to try to get counterplay by opening up the position. Here, white's bishop on d3 and white's queen on c2, they're sort of hemmed in by his own pawn. That pawn on e4 is just sort of a weak mess. So white dumps it off the board to try to get counterplay and to slow down some of black's initiative. So there. Again, going through this quickly, I don't want to make the video too long, but this is the critical line that I looked at. King h7. And this is the main position that I reached at the end of the line. This is almost completely finely balanced. Black has 3 pawns for the piece. White's king is definitely more exposed than black's king. But in return, white does have that piece, and black also has a very weak pawn in c7 that will more or less always fall. So this is a very precisely balanced position. If either side pushes too hard, they'll probably just get punished. So this would be the sort of position that, properly played, would result in perpetual check. But white dodges all of this and tries to keep tension in the position. Queen g5. The principal move. Black could also take. There's an adage that says the worst bishop is better than the best knight. Not necessarily always true, but getting the bishop on d3 off the board is an achievement of sort. Queen takes, and then black can play h5. This is sort of another way of massaging the king side for black. He's going to march his pawn forward to h4 and try to massage white's king side for weaknesses here or there. This is probably a little bit better for black. Black has the bishop pair. That's always something in the position. Black owns the a file, which is absolutely a resource, and that's sort of a weakness of white's earlier error with rook ac1. Yeah, this would be a little bit better for black. It would be my choice in this position, just because black has some very simple advantages that he can play with going forward from here. Queen g5 definitely continues to build the tension in the position, which may or may not be a good thing. So king h1, more or less forced. Queen h5, knight g1, and then f5. And this is the critical structural move that we've been sort of building towards the entire game. If black can achieve this and he's fine, black is at the very least equal. And black is perfectly fine here. So this is sort of a success for black in that sense. He's achieving the key structural move in this position. Knight c5, bishop c8, keeping his powerful light square bishop on the board. That is correct. Rook f1. A clear mistake. When you're defending, it's important to keep your pieces active. One of the reasons that defense is psychologically hard as a chess player is that you sort of instinctively go into turtle mode. You sort of passively stack your pieces up. You don't want to be doing that. You want to try to actively defend as much as possible. Rook f1 sort of keeps white... it takes white's rook off an active post and puts it in a passive post. Queen d3 is better. It actively defends. It's aiming at black's weak b pawn, which is a weakness. So one potential line that I'll look at, b4, e takes, knight e7. I would prefer black a little bit here, because white has more weaknesses. Both the d5 pawn and the f3 pawn are weaknesses, and the knight on g1 has to stay home and guard that weakness in f3. Black still has a bishop pair, and that's worth something in this position. This is still a fight, but I would give black a little bit of a nod. But rook f1 very clearly gives black a better position. So knight e7, e3, king h7, just sort of a general nice tuck-away move. When you have a superior position like this and you're not in a rush, and here, black isn't in a rush. All of his advantages are durable. He's got the bishop pair. White has a weakness on e4. Black has ownership of the a file, which is an advantage. All of these are assets that aren't in danger of going away. It's not like black has a temporary initiative that he needs to push at all costs. All of black's advantages here are durable and positional. So black can afford to take a little bit of a timeout to prepare some things. King h7 is just sort of a nice general preparation move. It tucks the black king away from danger. So knight f3. Knight g8, sort of a generally good move, but its execution is a little bit flawed. I would prefer queen g4 here. It prevents h3, which h3 is a little bit of a desirable move for white because it sort of keeps black's pieces from penetrating the king side, establishes a little bit more control of the white squares. So queen g4 sort of aims at both of those. Knight h4, queen g4, queen a8 is also possible. I would sort of prefer it here. It keeps tabs on the black b pawn. But queen g4, knight f5, knight f6. Not the most active. Rook a2, in my mind, is more critical. Whenever you can invade to the second rank with your rook, it's typically a fairly desirable thing to do so. One example line that I give in the analysis, queen b1. I'll just go through this quickly. Rook a4. And black's just going to win a pawn here. White does have some compensation. There are opposite colored bishops on the board, so if white's able to get the rooks off the board, that might be one method of saving grace here, or potentially getting his rook onto the 7th rank himself, get into a7 somehow. That would be a method of counterplay. But black's up a pawn here, and white needs to prove that he does have compensation for it. So knight f6, in my opinion, not the most accurate. h3, queen g6, and this is where we depart from the actual game. In the actual game, Vasily Ivanchuk chose g4, and I left the complete original game in the notes for people that want to look at it themselves. Knight e6 instead of g4 is an improvement that we're treated to from presumably the mind of Kasparov and Beth Harmon. Knight e6, it's the most natural move because you're just going ahead and penetrating with that strong piece. So rook a4, very logical, aiming right for the weak e4 pawn. b3, rook xe4. Just generally, I don't like that move. It leads to a position where white has a pawn in the 7th rank, there's no reason to allow that to happen. That's just asking for trouble. And not necessarily in a theoretical sense. I think black can hold after that. But just practically, you shouldn't put yourself in those sorts of positions. It's like throwing water out your front door when it's -10 and then trying to walk 20 minutes later. It's not a good idea. Those are the sort of metaphors we have in northern Indiana, by the way. Cold here sometimes. Rook xc4, just, it's asking for trouble. Knight xc4, if we want to sort of wind the game down, this is a very direct and immediate way of doing that. And one very pretty line, Knight xg3, very beautiful, and then white more or less is forced to bail out into a perpetual. Knight e7 is a very cute move, and that's a cute little perpetual. So I have some analysis of alternatives to rook xc4, which is the move I don't care for. So knight xd6, cxd, e7, bishop c5, and this is a very interesting position, and I did look over this position with Stockfish 13, which is the newest version of Stockfish. It gives some very strange recommendations. So generally, I haven't checked other people's sources, but generally I think black might be able to hold this, but not with his choice in the game. I think the choice in the game is clearly incorrect. Here, h5, is, in my opinion, is the best move. And the position I'm talking about plugging into the engine is this. And Stockfish 13 gives white a decisive advantage, but its recommended line is just shifting the white bishop back and forth along the a7 to g1 diagonal. Just a general lesson from this position. Queen e8 was played, and in my opinion, that's a complete error. Sort of the theme that we talked about earlier, don't defend passively. When you're defending, you want to generate counterplay. So instead of queen e8, h5 is generating counterplay. It's looking to create weakness on the king's side that black can exploit and create counterplay with. Never defend passively when you don't have to. Queen e8 sort of goes back on his heels when Borgov doesn't have to. Queen f3, queen c6, b4, and this is a true clear error. Queen e8 just loses by force. I give some deeper analysis in the notes, but just a quick better line. Something like this. And this is the way the positions should sort of go. White's going to convert, but this is definitely closer than what we see in the game. But that's an interesting game to look at in the PGN file that I'll link and look over the lines that I listed there. But queen e8 is a true error because, again, it's defending passively. Don't defend passively. If you just sit back and try to defend passively, you'll allow your opponent to tee off for free. Always put up as much of a fight as possible, however you can. Queen f5, king h8, and then the pretty move. This was played in the game, so of course Kasparov wants to create the prettiest variation possible for the viewers. It's not mandatory. Probably a better move is just queen e6. But that's not as fun. I mean, queen x f6 wins as well, so there's no reason to avoid that for the camera. And this is all winning by force. I'll just go through it relatively quickly. Queen h5. White goes ahead and queens at pawn. There was no way to prevent that. Black can basically change the move order of how white wins. That forces the black queen away anyways, and then white goes ahead and queens. But rook f, rook e2, king f1, desperately looking for a perpetual, but white easily punishes that. And then in this position, Vasily Borgov tips his king very graciously, and Beth Harmon wins the game. That is one praise I can give to the show, is that it very easily and very gracefully avoided all the tropes with the big bad. Vasily Borgov isn't shown as a bad guy or an evil foreigner, Ivan Drago style figure. He's just seen as a nice guy that happens to be good at chess and happens to be playing against Beth Harmon. I thought all of the characters in the Queen's Gambit were fully fleshed out and multidimensional, and that includes Beth Harmon's opponents. There was a lot of interesting tension between her opponents. That was fun to watch. But that's the end of this very interesting game. I love the fact that Kasparov found an actual game, but basically the last half of the last 25% of what we saw was just him coming up with an analysis and a different variation, which I thought was, as a chess player, absolutely fascinating. But this ends my series on the Netflix series, The Queen's Gambit. As a whole, I would absolutely recommend you watching it. It really nails what it's like to be a chess player and what it's like to play at a chess tournament, and the actual chess content is outstanding. So that's going to be it for this video. I am going to be moving forward with a new series. I'm going to be getting I have some ideas, but I want to reach out to my fans to see what sort of series they would prefer. But that's it. Thank you so much for coming back. My name is Salvatore, and I will see you later.